So California passed Senate Bill 132, which allows incarcerated, transgender, non-binary, and intersex men to be transferred into women's prisons. You know, we've been having this ongoing national discussion about protections of women with the transgender advocacy. And I think one of the big places that I guess maybe many in the nation forgot to look at was our prisons. And then we hear about the Senate bill, which has been signed into law. Well, now the system, they're facing pregnancies and increased violence in these facilities. Women are uncomfortable. They're terrified. They're being housed with males. And also corrections officers, female corrections officers, are also unable to really feel confident and comfortable doing their job. And now there are others that are trying to get Governor Gavin Newsom to halt transfers to protect these female inmates. And one of the groups leading the charge for this is WOLF, W-O-L-F, and that stands for Women's Liberation Front. Kate Fain is the Director of Communications for Women's Liberation Front, and she joins me to discuss what she's been hearing on this and to give people insight. I love the common ground that we can have with others, especially when it concerns protections for women. Kate, thanks so much for taking the time and joining us today. I appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
We, as you know, because you've been writing a lot about this, and Women's Liberation Front has been talking a lot about this as well, protections for women, whether it's speech and in sports, but in prisons, until I saw that this bill, and I regretfully was not aware of this, of course, until being in Texas, until Newsom signed it into law. And then it was, I think it was a local news station in Los Angeles that did a story on this and had talked to one of your legal counselors on this issue. And I was really shocked about the number, first off, the number of males that are being transferred into women's prisons. But the other thing is that all they have to do, from what I'm looking at, they're transferred over if they identify as a woman. But is there anything to actually measure or prove that identity? I mean, just to be generous with the thought for a moment, what is the protocol with that, and how in the world is this happening?
So no, there's essentially no safeguards in this bill. They not only don't have to do anything to prove their identity as a woman, but they actually don't even have to identify as a woman. For example, they could identify as non-binary or any other variety of gender. There is one new policy that recently was put in place after it was clear how many men were going to be taking advantage of this to request transfers, that forces them to go through a little bit of a curriculum. That's a short couple-hour, essentially like homework program where they have to write about their feelings and how scared they are to be housed with women. So the only safeguard that they have is really actually quite a joke.
I'm just absolutely shocked at that, because some of these prisoners, from what I understand, while they're maybe serving time for something else, they have a record that includes, sexual assault, rape. I think there was one that I think it was actually Women Liberation Front legal counselor had said that it was for repeated violent rape. Someone had a record, had a prior conviction of that. That's and are women prisoners, are they allowed to refuse to share housing with these men? Are they given any choice in that matter?
It's complicated, but in reality, no. They have to go through a whole lengthy process in order to deny being housed with someone, while meanwhile the male prisoners being sent in are actually able to request where they want to be housed. For a woman to deny a roommate, she has to declare them as an enemy, and it's a whole process that we've actually seen has resulted in retaliation when women do try to get the men out of their rooms.
Oh my goodness. Now I know you all at Women's Liberation Front have been talking to the women who are in the women's prison. What have you been hearing from these female inmates? I can only imagine how terrified some of them must be.
Yeah, so us and our partner organization, Woman to Woman, have spoken to hundreds of inmates in California's facilities. They're describing it as a nightmare's worst nightmare, being housed with these men. Over 80% of incarcerated women have experienced a history of physical, sexual, or domestic violence and abuse. And these women are now being re-traumatized by being forced to live with these men. And we're hearing stories of symptoms of PTSD coming back. We're hearing stories of women being assaulted. And now we're actually hearing in the most severe case, a story that a woman has actually become pregnant within the prison system after being forced to be housed with one of these men. And so the conditions here are just completely inhumane. inhumane. It's cruel and unusual punishment by nearly any measure of that standard. And it's something that international law actually even prohibits as a war crime if this were to be done to prisoners of war. And this is what we're doing to California's incarcerated women in what's considered a democratic society.
Yeah, and we're talking with Kate Fain with Women's Liberation Front. She's their communications director, and she also operates a website and does a number of things too. One of the other stories, one of the other reports coming out is that the prison began handing women condoms and then information as to what their options were if they were to become pregnant. That sounds to me like they're suggesting that there might be some non-consensual, a crime that's going to be occurring in the jail where these male inmates would be preying upon the female inmates.
Yes, exactly. In the California prison system, actually all sexual activity is considered non-consensual by default. And so by handing condoms to the female inmates, what they're essentially doing is admitting that they know that they're going to be raped and that, oh, well, here, at least you have a condom, as if that was ever any sort of, it's a Band-Aid on a bullet wound when you're dealing with sexual assault.
Wow. And the female corrections officers as well. I know some of those, I know your group has spoken to some of those. I can't imagine how, if I were a a corrections officer in this prison, because apparently it doesn't mean that they're excused from performing strip searches on some of these incoming inmates. And if it's a man who says that he's a woman, a female corrections officer would still have to take on that strip search. That cannot be comfortable.
That's exactly right. And what we're actually hearing is that the men are taking advantage of that moment, as can be expected, to sexually harass the COs. Oh. And these are, when you're dealing with men versus women, there are physical differences, and even the power dynamics within prison of COs versus the inmates does not change that power and physical dynamic that you're dealing with. And the COs are being put at risk. We hear that they're deeply unhappy with how this is being played out. But unfortunately, the individual COs, and honestly, even individual prisons, have their hands tied because of this law that was passed, SB 132, which was authored by Senator Scott Wiener of California, which essentially forces the prisons to do just this. And we know that the prisons do care about the safety of the women in their care, but there's only so much they can do under this policy. Their hands are essentially tied.
And that's awful because they know there's nothing that they could do. I can imagine if these female corrections officers were to speak out, even to advocate for the women that are under their care while incarcerated, they would get fired, wouldn't they?
Yes, and I believe that we've heard that their union is telling them not to speak to us.
Oh my, that's, oh goodness. So then you have to question, well, who are these people actually there to take care of? It does seem that you're prioritizing the incoming male inmates. How many men, Kate, have been transferred over to the women's prison so far since this bill passed?
So we know that there have been about 300 requests for transfer, but most of those are still pending, actually. And the numbers are a little bit hard to get an exact count on because we believe that the prison system is not accurately reporting the sex of everyone who is being transferred. What we know is at a minimum, there are 14 men who have been reported to be transferred into CCWF. And we believe that there are actually over 20, and at the peak, there may have been 28 men. And it does seem that in response to some of the news that's been coming out, including the potential pregnancy, that some of these men may have been moved into isolation in order to separate them from the general population and to further obscure the numbers.
Oh my goodness, and not even being able to rely on those institutions, to be honest about it.